It was January 17th, 1991. Deep beneath Baghdad, in a command center built to Soviet specifications, Iraqi officers shouted into telephones, their voices tight with rising panic. Among them, silent and watchful, sat a handful of Soviet military advisors. Their leader, Colonel Vadim Morozov, was not a man given to emotion. He was an observer, a signals intelligence specialist from the GRU. His job was to report on the performance of Soviet-supplied hardware and the competence of their Iraqi clients. On both counts, he was unimpressed. But this was different. The green phosphor screens of the P-18 spoon-rest early warning radars were supposed to be his eyes. They were the front line of the most sophisticated, dense, and layered air defense system in the entire Middle East. A system built, trained, and guaranteed by the Soviet Union. It was a fortress of overlapping surface-to-air missile sites, SA-2, SA-3, SA-6, all knitted together by a French-built command and control system known as CARI. It was designed to bleed any attacker white. At precisely 2:30 in the morning, the fortress dissolved. It did not crack, it did not bend, it simply evaporated. Morozov watched his screen. The primary radar sweeps, pulsing with mechanical regularity, suddenly filled with ghosts. The displays bloomed with noise, a blizzard of false signals and electronic static so dense it was impossible to pick out a single valid target. It was not jamming as he knew it. Jamming was a clumsy, powerful fist. This was a scalpel. This was electronic poison. Then, the command nodes went dark. One by one, the sector command centers, the brains of the Iraqi air defense, simply vanished. An officer across the room slammed his fist on a console. The CARI network was blind. The fortress had no eyes. Morozov's heart went cold. This was not a malfunction. This was a decapitation. The Americans had found a way to behead them before the first bomb had even fallen. But the true horror was just beginning. With the ground radars blinded, the Iraqis did the only thing they could. They scrambled their fighters. This was the moment the Soviets had planned for. This was the domain of the Ground-Controlled Intercept, or GCI. Iraqi pilots, flying some of the most advanced export aircraft in the Soviet arsenal, were trained to rely on operators in bunkers, just like this one. The operators would use their powerful ground radars to find the enemy, guide their pilots into a perfect firing position, and tell them exactly when to fire. The pilot was just a trigger puller in a complex, ground-based machine. The machine was now broken, but the pilot still went up, flying blind into the dark. From the west, the first wave of Iraqi MiG-29 aircraft, the pride of their air force, a machine designed to brawl with the best of NATO, thundered into the blackness. They were hunters. On Morozov's remaining sector screens, their friendly IFF tags, identify friend or foe, crawled across the display. Then, they began to disappear. There was no warning, no panicked radio call, no enemy signal detected. One moment, the green symbol for a MiG-29 aircraft was tracking northwest. The next, it was gone. Simply gone. As if it had never existed. An Iraqi controller shouted a call sign. The radio answered with static. "Where is he?" a general demanded, his voice cracking. "Where is my pilot?" Morozov stared at the screen, his mind racing. A technical failure? 2 pilots at once? Impossible. A collision? In that much empty sky? Another friendly symbol vanished. This time, a Mirage F-1. Then another MiG-29 aircraft. It was a massacre, conducted by a phantom. The Iraqi pilots were not engaging in dogfights. They were not firing missiles. They were not even reporting contact. They were simply being erased from the sky, one by one, in methodical silence. This was the impossible event. This was the mystery that froze the blood of the Soviet advisors. Their pilots, in their best machines, were being slaughtered by an enemy they could not see, could not detect, and could not fight. The Americans, it seemed, had a ghost. And this ghost was systematically dismantling an entire air force in a matter of minutes. This is the kind of dominance that changes the world. And this is the kind of history we explore. Welcome to Cold War Impact. If you want to understand the technology, the strategy, and the real stories behind the greatest power struggle in human history, subscribe to the channel. You won't find this detail anywhere else. Back in the bunker, the immediate reaction was not shock. It was confusion, a deep, profound, and terrifying confusion. The Iraqi officers defaulted to denial, blaming their equipment. "The radars are faulty," one major yelled. "The radios are jammed!" But Colonel Morozov knew Soviet hardware. It was robust. It was simple. It failed, yes, but not like this. Not all at once. Not so. Precisely. He looked at his fellow advisors. Their faces were pale, their knuckles white. They were thinking the same thing. This was not a glitch. This was a new kind of war. The stakes for Moscow were catastrophic. This was not just about Iraq. This was about the Soviet Union. The Iraqi military was a mirror image of their own. It used their tanks, their missiles, their aircraft, and most importantly, their doctrine. The core belief of Soviet air defense was the supremacy of the ground. The idea that a powerful, integrated network of radars and surface-to-air missiles, all guided by human controllers, could defeat any air attack. It was the philosophy they had sold to the world, the shield they had built for their allies, and the very system protecting the Soviet homeland itself. And in less than an hour, this phantom had proven it worthless. What was this thing? This invisible force that could blind their radars at will? This silent hunter that could pluck their best fighters from the sky without ever appearing on a single screen? Morozov watched the screens, now mostly dark. The few remaining Iraqi fighter symbols were turning back, running for their lives. The invasion had begun, and the shield of the state had been shattered by an enemy that was, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. The reports he would have to send to Moscow would be treated as madness, as exaggeration. But he had seen it. The air war over Iraq was not a battle. It was an execution, carried out by an invisible executioner. The mystery was total, and for the men in that bunker, the Cold War, in that moment, was already over. They just didn't know it yet. The journey from Baghdad to Moscow was silent and grim. Colonel Morozov's report was not a report, it was a confession of failure. Not his own, but the failure of an entire generation of Soviet military doctrine. When he and the other advisors presented their findings at the Frunze Military Academy, the initial reaction was disbelief, quickly followed by cold, professional fury. The scramble to understand what happened in the skies over Iraq began immediately. It was not just a military investigation, it was an inquest. The main intelligence directorate, the GRU, took the lead, impounding every scrap of data. They analyzed the radar tapes from the P-18 radars, expecting to find subtle signatures of American electronic warfare. They found nothing. Only the raw, blinding snow of the jamming, so total and overwhelming that it was less a signal and more a complete absence of information. It was as if the Americans had found a switch to turn off the very laws of physics on which Soviet radar relied. They debriefed the Iraqi pilots who had managed to land, their airframes sometimes pockmarked with shrapnel from missiles they had never even seen. The pilots' testimonies were useless. They were the ravings of terrified men, but they were all consistent. I was flying my patrol as ordered. One MiG-29 pilot, a veteran of the Iran-Iraq War, stated, his hands shaking. My radar warning receiver was silent, completely silent. The sky was empty. My ground controller said nothing. Then I looked to my left, and my wingman, he just exploded. Not a fireball, a flash, like a light bulb. One moment he was there, the next, just pieces. Another pilot, from a MiG-25 squadron, reported a similar impossibility. I was high, at 15,000 meters, pushing Mach 2. Nothing can touch me. I am the fastest man in the sky. My radar was on. It saw nothing. Then, a warning. Not a lock, just a proximity alert I have never heard before. 2 seconds later, my right engine disintegrated. I did not see a missile. I did not see an aircraft. I just fell. They found nothing. The object, the attacker, the phantom, it just vanished every time. These reports were compiled, cross-referenced, and analyzed by the brightest minds in the Soviet air defense forces. The conclusion was horrifying in its simplicity. The Americans were engaging and destroying Soviet-built fighters from ranges beyond the detection range of their own radars, and they were doing it without the Iraqi pilots ever receiving a single launch warning. This combination was technically impossible. A radar-guided missile, by its very nature, required the attacking aircraft to illuminate the target with a powerful continuous beam of radar energy. This energy, this lock, was the first thing a pilot's warning receiver would scream about. It was the signal to brake, to dive, to deploy flares and chaff. but the Iraqi pilots heard nothing. This implied the missile was a fire-and-forget weapon, one that guided itself. The Soviets had their own, the R-77, in development, but it was years from service. Had the Americans perfected it? Even if they had, it didn't explain the other half of the mystery. To fire the missile, the attacker still had to find the target. This required a radar, a powerful fighter radar. And that radar's energy, its sweep, should have been detected. It too should have lit up the Iraqi warning receivers long before the pilot was in firing range. Unless the attacker wasn't using its radar at all. This thought, whispered in the back rooms of the analysis committees, built the legend. A new bogeyman was born. It was not a jet, it was a ghost, a whisper in the dark. Soviet pilots stationed in East Germany, sitting on high alert, began to hear the rumors from Baghdad. They were told of an American, something that was invisible to radar, invisible to the eye, and fired missiles that gave no warning. It was a perfect killing machine. Morale, already brittle in the fading days of the Soviet Empire, began to chip. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see? How do you deter a weapon that breaks the rules of engagement? The investigation in Moscow descended into a morass of paranoia and increasingly desperate theories. The Soviet military was a vast, conservative, and compartmentalized organism. It was not built for innovation. It was built for mass. And it could not comprehend a threat that was not also based on mass. The wrong conclusions began to stack up, each one more terrifying than the last. The first theory was a new, revolutionary stealth aircraft. They knew of the F-117. They had seen the grainy photos, but that was a subsonic bomber, a clumsy, faceted triangle designed to hit ground targets. It had no radar. It carried no air-to-air missiles. It could not, by any stretch of the imagination, be the invisible hunter that was slaughtering their MiG-29 aircraft. Therefore, the Americans must have another one. A secret supersonic stealth fighter. A phantom that could dogfight. This theory was presented to the highest levels of the Politburo, and it caused a panic. If the Americans had a truly invisible fighter, then every ruble spent on the massive Soviet air defense network was worthless. The entire border, from the Barents Sea to the Pacific, was wide open. The second theory focused on the missiles. Perhaps the aircraft was irrelevant. Perhaps it was a normal F-15 or F-16 fighter. The real weapon, they argued, was a new kind of missile. One that was home on jam. A missile that, instead of following a radar reflection, locked onto the jamming signal from the Iraqi aircraft themselves. This was a chilling thought, as it turned their own defensive equipment against them. But it didn't fit all the facts. It didn't explain the pilots who were not jamming, who were flying with radars off, and were still destroyed. The third and most prevalent theory, the one that gained the most traction because it was the most bureaucratically comfortable, was that it was not one thing, but a complex system. They argued that the Americans had perfected a new kind of electronic warfare. They believed the Americans were using a new, high-altitude, specialized aircraft, a successor to the EF-111 Raven that was so powerful it could not only blind their ground radars, but also project false targets. And, most insidiously, it could somehow mask the launch of friendly missiles, perhaps by creating a corridor of electronic silence. The Soviets settled on a version of this third theory. It was the least damaging to their ego. It meant their fighters were not obsolete, just unsupported. It meant their doctrine was not wrong, just countered by a new electronic trick. They believed the Americans had found a new, clever way to jam them, while using a new, long-range, fire-and-forget missile. They were wrong. They were profoundly, dangerously, and completely wrong. They were looking for a new missile. They were looking for a new, secret jamming plane. They were looking for a phantom stealth fighter that didn't exist. They were looking in all the wrong places. They were hunting a ghost, a bogeyman of their own creation. The truth was not a single, secret weapon. It was a combination of two publicly known technologies, two machines the Americans had been flying for over a decade. And the Soviets' failure to understand how these two systems worked together was the real secret, and the real, devastating gap in their understanding of modern war. The answer was not a secret. It was hiding in plain sight. While the Soviets hunted ghosts in a windowless, air-conditioned trailer in the middle of the Saudi desert, an American airman was watching the entire war unfold. He was not a pilot. He was a weapons controller, sitting at a blue-lit console inside a scope van. He was one of hundreds, all networked. And he was getting his data from a machine that was, at that moment, the single most valuable asset in the entire American military arsenal. It was not a fighter. It was not a bomber. It was a modified Boeing 707 airliner with a massive 30-foot rotating radar dome balanced on its back. Its name was the E-3 Sentry. The crews called it AWACS. This was the source. This was the American solution. And it was a secret. Not because the machine itself was hidden, the Soviets had known about AWACS for over a decade, but because they had fundamentally, catastrophically misunderstood what it was for. To the Soviet mind, a radar was either on the ground, where it was powerful but vulnerable, or it was on a fighter, where it was small, weak, and limited. They had their own AWACS equivalent, the Tupolev Tu-126 MOS, but it was a clumsy, technically inferior machine designed primarily to spot bombers over the Arctic. It was a defensive picket fence. The American E-3 Sentry was a sword. It was a flying command center, a digital brain. Its powerful Doppler radar was not just a sensor, it was a god's eye view. Flying high above the battlefield, far back from the front lines and safe from any threat, it could look down. It could cut through the ground clutter, the radio wave reflections from hills and buildings that blinded all ground-based radars. It could detect, track, and identify every single aircraft in the sky from the moment its wheels left the runway. While Colonel Morozov and his Iraqi counterparts were staring at screens full of static, the AWACS controllers were looking at a pristine digital map of the entire battle space. They saw every Iraqi jet take off. They knew its altitude, its speed, its heading. And they could talk to the hunters. This was the other half of the Phantom, the McDonnell Douglas F-15 Eagle. Like the AWACS, the F-15 aircraft was not new. It had been flying since the 1970s. The Soviets knew it well. They had built their best fighter, the MiG-29, specifically to kill it. On paper, in a one-on-one knife fight, the MiG-29 was a worthy opponent, agile, powerful, and deadly. But the Americans had no intention of getting into a knife fight. The F-15 Eagle was born from the brutal lessons of the Vietnam War, where American F-4 Phantom aircraft, burdened with missiles they didn't trust, were forced into circling dogfights with nimble, cannon-armed MiG-21 aircraft. The designers of the F-15 were given a simple, ruthless creed: not a pound for air to ground. The Eagle was not a multi-role truck. It was a pure, thoroughbred air superiority fighter. It was built with two massive, powerful engines that gave it more thrust than its own weight, allowing it to accelerate while climbing straight up. And it was built with the world's most powerful and sophisticated fighter radar, the APG-63. This radar had a revolutionary look-down divided by shoot-down capability. It could pick a single enemy fighter out of the ground clutter that blinded Soviet-era jets. This, the Soviets knew. This is what they expected. And this is the trap they fell into. The ingenuity of the American solution was not the F-15 aircraft, and it was not the AWACS. It was the system that linked them. It was a new doctrine, a new way of thinking about war, enabled by a secure, jam-proof digital connection called Link 16. This link turned the American Phantom from a theory into a battlefield reality. Here is how the invisible kill happened. Far from the battle, an E-3 AWACS scans the airspace. Its powerful radar paints an Iraqi MiG-29 aircraft taking off from an airfield near Baghdad. The AWACS controller tags it as hostile. 60 miles away, an American F-15 Eagle is on station, flying a patrol pattern. His cockpit is dark. His own powerful APG-63 radar is off. He is electronically silent. He is invisible. The Iraqi pilot's radar warning receiver is quiet. The Soviet-built ground radars see nothing but empty sky. Then, a symbol flashes to life on the F-15 pilot's central screen. It is the Iraqi MiG-29 aircraft. The data is not coming from his own radar. It is being piped directly to him from the AWACS. He is not just a pilot. He is a node in a network. The AWACS is his long-range eyes. The F-15 pilot turns to intercept, still silent. The AWACS talks to his aircraft, guiding him into a perfect firing position. The Iraqi pilot, flying blind, has no idea that a killer is now stalking him from miles away, just below the horizon. The F-15 pilot selects his weapon, the AIM-7 Sparrow. This was the final, brilliant piece of the puzzle. The Soviets, in their paranoia, had imagined a new magical fire-and-forget missile. The truth was far more humiliating. The Sparrow was an old, reliable weapon from the 1960s. It was a semi-active missile, meaning it required the F-15 aircraft to paint the target with its radar for the missile to follow the beam. This, by all Soviet logic, should have given the Iraqi pilot a launch warning the second the F-15 pilot fired, but the Americans had changed the rules. The F-15 pilot, guided by AWACS, gets the launch-authorized cue on his head's up display. He presses the red button on his stick. The missile leaps off the rail, climbing on a column of smoke, flying on inertia and data link updates from the F-15 aircraft. For the first 30 seconds of its flight, the F-15's radar remains off. The missile is flying blind, but it's flying toward a precise point in space where the AWACS knows the target will be. The Iraqi pilot, fat, dumb, and happy, continues his climb, his warning receivers utterly silent. Then, in the last 10 seconds of the missile's life, only then, the F-15 pilot flips a switch. His APG-63 radar springs to life, its powerful beam painting the MiG-29 aircraft. In the Iraqi cockpit, all hell breaks loose. The RWR screams, a high-pitched, terrifying wail. A launch warning! He is locked! He yanks his stick, popping flares and chaff, his heart leaping into his throat. But it is too late. A missile he never saw, fired from an aircraft he never detected, is already pitbull. It's in its terminal phase. The Iraqi pilot had 10 seconds of warning. He needed 11. A flash of light, a cloud of vaporized metal and fuel. On the AWACS console, a controller simply says, "Splash 1." This was the Phantom. This was the Ghost. It was not a secret aircraft. It was a new philosophy. The Soviets had built a rigid, ground-based system that treated pilots as puppets. The Americans had built a flexible, airborne system that turned its pilots into empowered, all-seeing hunters. It was a victory of innovation, not of mass. And it was a secret that was hidden in plain sight, in user manuals and technical specifications the Soviets had had for years. They just hadn't known how to read them. The Gulf War ended not with a bang, but with a spreadsheet. In the spring of 1991, in a secure facility outside Moscow, the final, agonizing debrief took place. The data was all in. They had flight logs, satellite imagery, signals intelligence intercepts from their Spetsnaz teams, and, most importantly, fragments of the missiles themselves. The confrontation was not with an American pilot. It was with the cold, undeniable facts. The analysts, men who had dedicated their lives to Soviet air power, pinned the data to a board. On one side, a list of every confirmed Iraqi air-to-air loss, 39 aircraft. 36 of them shot down by the United States Air Force. The other side of the board was the American losses to Iraqi fighters. It was a blank, white space. "This is not possible," a general of aviation stated, his voice flat. "No air force in history has achieved such a thing. Not the Germans in 40, not the Israelis in 67. It is a statistical impossibility. There are errors in the data. The data is confirmed, Comrade General," a young GRU colonel replied, his face pale. "The errors are not in the data. The errors are in us." He pointed to the missile fragments. They had all been identified. They were not a new, secret weapon. They were not a fire-and-forget Phantom missile. They were AIM-7 Sparrows. Old, 1960s-era, semi-active Sparrows. The same missiles they had been studying and dismissing for 2 decades. The room fell silent. This was the shock. The shock was not a moment of terror. It was a moment of profound, bone-deep humiliation. It was the sickening realization that they hadn't been defeated by a secret trillion-ruble stealth project. They had been defeated by publicly known technology they had fatally misunderstood. They hadn't been outfought. They had been outthought. The young colonel continued, his voice quiet but merciless. "We were looking for a Phantom. We were hunting a Ghost. We believed they had a new stealth fighter, something to rival our MFI project. We were wrong. The killer was the F-15 Eagle." "The Eagle?" the general scoffed. "Our MiG-29 can turn with the Eagle. Our pilots are as good as theirs. That cannot be." "It can be, Comrade General," the colonel said, "because the F-15 pilot never turned. He never dogfought. He never even saw his target with his own eyes. He was a puppet, just like ours. He then projected a diagram on the wall that would end the Cold War. It was a simple flow chart. At the top, a symbol for the E3 AWACS. Below it, a data link. And at the bottom, 4 F-15 Eagle aircraft, flying in a line. "Here is the Phantom," the colonel said, tapping the AWACS symbol. "The Americans took our own doctrine, ground-controlled intercept, and they perfected it. They put the radar and the controller in the sky, far behind the battle, completely invulnerable." He explained the tactic. The AWACS sees all. The F-15 aircraft fly with their radars off, electronically silent, invisible. The AWACS guides them. The pilot is just a weapon system operator. He doesn't hunt. He is vectored. He doesn't search. He is told. "And the missile?" the general asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The Sparrow. The simplest part? The F-15, guided by the AWACS, gets within range. He fires the missile while his radar is still off. The missile flies on data link commands. Then, only in the last seconds, 10, maybe 15, does the Eagle paint the target. The Iraqi pilot gets a warning, screams, and then he dies. The room was a tomb. The bogeyman was not a monster. It was a system, a network. The Americans had created a digital, airborne organism. The F-15 was not an aircraft, it was a Talon. The AWACS was not a radar plane, it was the brain. The Soviet Union, by contrast, had built a magnificent, muscular but headless body. Their MiG-29 aircraft were brilliant individual gladiators sent into the arena blindfolded, one by one, to be slaughtered by a networked team of executioners who saw their every move. The entire Soviet design philosophy of rugged, simple, independent fighters was exposed as a catastrophic failure. The futile response began before the ink was dry on the report. It was a panic. A desperate last-gasp scramble to close a gap they now realized was not a gap, but a canyon. First, the missiles. If the Americans had mastered the fire-and-forget missile with the AMRAAM, which they had also used in Iraq, but whose success was overshadowed by the sheer volume of Sparrow kills, then the Soviet Union must have one now. The R-77, what NATO would call the Adder, was ripped from development and shoved into production. It was a brilliant missile, with a unique lattice-fin tail for incredible agility. It was, on paper, an AMRAAM killer. Second, the aircraft. The existing MiG-29 fleet was obsolete. A crash program, the MiG-29 seconds, was ordered. It would have a new radar, the N-19M, which could finally track multiple targets. It would have a new digital computer. It would have the wiring to fire the new R-77. It was a desperate attempt to create an Eagle of their own. Third, the brain. The lumbering Tu-126 Moss was a joke. The new A-50 mainstay, their own AWACS, was rushed into service. They had to build a network. They had to copy the American system, but it was all for nothing. The countermeasures failed completely and utterly for one simple, brutal reason. The Soviet Union was dead. The year was 1991. The checks to the design bureaus were bouncing. The factories had no steel. The pilots had no fuel to train. The R-77 missiles were built, but only in handfuls, reserved for a war that would never come. The MiG-29 seconds upgrade was so expensive that only a few squadrons received it. The A-50 mainstay aircraft were produced, but they lacked the sophisticated computers and, most importantly, the digital data links to create a true, functioning network. They were hollow shells. The Soviet military had finally seen the ghost. They had identified it, analyzed it, and even designed the weapons to fight it. But the confrontation came years too late. The Soviet system, so focused on imitation rather than innovation, had spent itself to death building thousands of tanks and fighters that were now, in the new age of networked warfare, nothing more than expensive, disconnected targets. The shock was the realization that the game had changed, and they had not even been invited to play. The verdict was written in the sky over Iraq, but it was finalized in the history books. The killer statistic, the single brutal number that finalized the American dominance, is not just from the Gulf War. It is the entire combat legacy of the Phantom itself. As of this recording, in its entire operational history spanning nearly half a century, the F-15 Eagle has an air-to-air combat record of 104 victories and 0 losses. 104 to 0. This is not a statistic, It is a judgment. It is the final, unassailable verdict on an entire generation of military philosophy. The MiG-29 aircraft, the Su-27, the pride of the Soviet design bureaus, they were built to be eagle killers. And yet, in every real-world confrontation, from Iraq to the Balkans, the result was the same. The gladiators were slaughtered by the system. The Soviet Union's best were not just defeated, they were rendered statistically irrelevant. This failure connects directly to the macro theme, the deep systemic rot that brought the entire Soviet empire crashing down. The mystery of the Phantom in Iraq was not just a technological failure, it was a philosophical one. It was the inevitable endpoint of a system built on imitation, not innovation. The Soviet Union was perhaps the greatest industrial imitator in human history. When the West developed a technology, the Soviet design bureaus, often with staggering genius, would replicate it. They saw the American B-29 superfortress and, in an astonishing feat of reverse engineering, produced the Tu-4. They saw the F-4 Phantom, and they built the MiG-23. They saw the F-15 Eagle, and they built the Su-27 Flanker, an aircraft that, in terms of raw aerodynamics, was its equal, or even its superior. But that was the trap. They were always copying the last war's masterpiece. While Soviet engineers were perfecting the physical act of dogfighting, American engineers at places like the MIT Lincoln Laboratory were perfecting the network. While Soviet industry was pouring out thousands of tons of titanium for fighter airframes, American industry was mastering the esoteric magic of microprocessors, data links, and fault-tolerant software. The American Phantom that so terrified the Soviets was not a piece of hardware. The F-15 and the AWACS were just the visible parts. The real weapon was the system. It was the invisible web of data that connected the brain, the AWACS, to the Talon, the F-15. It was the software that fused radar, signals intelligence, and command decisions into a single, coherent picture. This was a leap the Soviet Union could not make. It was not just an industrial problem, it was a cultural one. A networked, information-based system requires a culture of decentralization, flexibility, and trust. It requires controllers and pilots to be empowered to make decisions based on a flow of data. The Soviet system was the opposite. It was a rigid, top-down pyramid. It was built on paranoia and central control. The pilot was an instrument, not an operator. The general in the bunker was the one who mattered. This philosophy, which had worked to hurl masses of T-34 tanks against the Wehrmacht, was utterly helpless against an enemy that could think, share, and kill at the speed of light. The microchip had defeated the smokestack. The Gulf War was simply the first public demonstration of this fact. The Soviet Union's attempt to copy the American system in the aftermath, the rushed R-77 missile, the A-50 mainstay, was a death spasm. The cost of trying to imitate this new, networked warfare was the final bankrupting straw for an economy already hollowed out by decades of focusing on quantity over quality, imitation over innovation. They could build the body of a modern military, but they could not create the nervous system. And so, we end with the epilogue. The mystery that Colonel Morozov confronted in that smoke-filled Baghdad bunker on January 17, 1991, was not, in the end, a military one. The Phantom that hunted his pilots from the dark was not an American aircraft. It was the future. It was the arrival of a new age, a war of information, not just of steel. The Soviets were masters of the industrial war. They had prepared for a great, grinding conflict of divisions and squadrons, a World War II played out with jets and nuclear-tipped missiles. They stood on their iron ramparts, listening for the thunder of engines and the roar of bombers. They were listening for the wrong thing. The future did not arrive with a roar. It arrived as a whisper. A silent, digital data stream from a radar plane 100 miles away. A symbol on a screen in a darkened cockpit. A launch-authorized cue. It was a verdict, delivered in silence, from an enemy they never saw, by a weapon they had fatally misunderstood. The Cold War was not won in a cataclysmic final battle. It was won in the 10-second gap between a launch warning and an impact. A gap created not by a better jet, but by a better idea. And it was in that silent, terrifying gap that the true power dynamic of the last half-century was finally and irrevocably revealed.